India Review Rethinking Central Planning, a federal critic of Planning Commission, Wilford Swindon and Rekha Saxena. Abstract. This article critically assesses the impact of Planning Commission on center-state relations in India. It argues that the Planning Commission had a centralizing effect due to its role in overseeing 5-year and annual planning, its contribution to designing and overseeing centrally sponsored schemes (CSS), and its involvement in discretionary grant making, central policy priorities, and interstate disagreement prevented the Planning Commission from acquiring the role of shared rule institution capable of offsetting the centralizing implications of aforementioned policies. The article then speculates on what prompted the recent replacement of the Planning Commission with the Niti Aayog and what this may mean for shared rule and nature of collaborative federalism in India more in general. Introduction. The 2014 BJP election manifesto envisages the abolition of the Planning Commission as a non-statutory body. Its abolition and replacement were feasible objectives. Indeed, shortly after it assumed power as a majority government, the BJP followed through on its election promise. The factor that led to the demise of the Planning Commission. Hereafter, planning commissions are manifold. From the economics side, the main criticism concerned the inability of the Commission to adapt properly to the transformation of Indian economy from a planned state-led economy to a more liberalized economy since the 1990s and the resulting rise in the private sector investment. Other criticism related to the process of planning itself. One procedural one of contention concerned the need for planning in fixed 5-year cycles, though with plan periods that did not coincide with legislative 5-year cycles at the center. Another process related critique related to distinction between so-called planned and non-planned expenditure within central and state budgets, and within those an additional subdivision between revenue and capital expenditure. This helped to undermine the cohesiveness of planning. A further criticism concerned the staffing of the Planning Commission. It was perceived as having too many generalists rather than sector specialists. IAS, Indian Administrative Services, and IES, Indian Economic Services officials were not properly equipped to provide the kind of interdisciplinary but sector specific knowledge that is required to design successful programs in the infrastructure and social development. Although each of the above criticism undermined the legitimacy of the Planning Commission, the focus of this article lies with another critic, namely the assertion that the Planning Commission was perceived as a de facto arm of the central government, which through grant making and central state planning added to the centralization of Indian federalism. Hence, this article seeks to provide a critical analysis of the achievements and the shortcomings of the Planning Commission from the perspective of center-state relation in India. To do so, a review of the main and secondary literature on the Planning Commission was conducted and an analysis performed for the most relevant policy document emanating from the Indian government or think tank. We also conducted elite interviews with former members of the Planning Commission, former members of the Finance Commission, current employees of the Niti Aayog, and a secretary in the Ministry of Finance. These interviews took place in the February-March 2015 and the February 2016, with a single follow-up interview in December 2016. The position of this article is that the Planning Commission, through its role in the allocation of the discretionary grants to the state and its capacity in co-shaping and monitoring a wide array of centrally sponsored schemes, not only added to the interdependence of the Indian federalism, but also to its centralization. This is so because the states were insufficiently involved in the decision makings in these areas. The states did not acquire more say rules to offset the increasing intrusions of the center in the funding of their competencies. Furthermore, the planning commission also appeared to erode some of the activities of the finance commission, a statutory body which has allocated pool tax revenues to the center and the states in the less discretionary and more formulaic manner. To make the above argument in full, this article is structured in the following way. In the first section, we situate the Planning Commission within the broader framework of the Indian federalism. Subsequently, we demonstrate how the Planning Commission has contributed to eroding the self-rule of the stateless and at times seem to be undermine the working of the Finance Commission. Next, analysis of the limited extent to which states were involved in the uploading their preferences through shared rule mechanism within the PC as shown. The final section presents a primarily assessment of the how the replacement of the planning commission with Niti Aayog National Institute for Transforming India may affect center state relation in India. It should be emphasized this article does not seek to provide a full fledged comparison of the planning commission with the Niti in this regard. After all, the current government still adheres to current planning cycle 2012, 16 and 17 and the Niti has not been in operation for long enough to provide a comprehensive comparison with its procedures. Situating the Planning Commission in Indian federalism. In a recent article on federalism, Waller and the Torkelson situate and compare a range of the federal countries based on two criteria: centralization versus decentralization, and autonomy versus interdependence. For them, decentralization implies the removal of core physical, jurisdictional, and or administrative resources from the center to lower levels of the multi-tiered system. The opposite holds for centralization. The centralization distinction implies a clear trade-off across level, where the state level loses, the center level gains, and vice versa. The same does not necessarily hold for the interdependent autonomy distinctions. What the state level loses in term of autonomy does not necessarily produce full-scale central and the federal control. And reality, autonomy loses could strengthen and the interdependence between the levels and the increase in the input of the state in the governance of the center. For instance, when powers of the German lender shifted to the center in the German federalism during 1960s and 1970s by expanding the current list at the expense of the exclusive legislative power of the lender increased their influence in the central decision making in return by increasing the list of the federal legislative powers, acquiring the consent of the German Bundesrat, the federal second chamber in which members of the land or state executives are directly represented. Waller or Tholksen identify two key sources of the interdependence: concurrent jurisdiction or legislative powers in the same policy field share competencies had a functional distribution of power in which one level of the government legislates in a particular field but the other is charged with its implementation. Administrative federalism. Based on their distinction, India is a relatively centralized federation, at least compared with Canada, Switzerland, and the US, which are often portrayed as high decentralized. The number of union and the concurrent power under the 7th schedule of the constitutions outweigh the number of the exclusive power in the state list. The residual power reside with the center, and the center can legislate in the exclusive state list. For instance, when disbursing conditional grants to the state in area of exclusive state and legislative competence. Emergency powers such as the president's rule add to this centralized impression. Indian fiscal federalism is also relatively centralized. See also contribution by Rajaraman to his specialist too. The central controls the ways and the rate as well as they collect personal income tax, corporate income tax, union excise duties, customer taxes or services. But shares the proceeds with the states. The state taxes only the sales taxes an important source of the state revenue. In 2007, central taxes made up 59% of the all taxes revenue compared with the 41% of the state taxes. The the fiscally dominant position of the center has led to consider vertical fiscal imbalances, increasing the dependence of the state on central funding. At the same time, the constitutional design of Indian federalism is also relatively interdependent. The constitution not only contains a long list of the concurrent competencies under which the center and the state can each operate, including education and health, but it also makes the center largely dependent on the state, urban and rural local governments for the implementation of its competencies. As table 1 ये है. Illustrate except for defense, housing, industry, minerals, transport and communication, the state are to spend the center on numerous occasions by ratio of 4 or 3 to 1. The presence of large-scale central state interdependence necessitates adequate shared rule or intergovernmental mechanism by which state entities and the main state government can articulate their presence and relations to center at a shared rule mechanism in India are only weakly institutionalized. The Rajya Sabha second chamber is not an effective second chamber representing state interest. States are represented in the proportion to their population, and the member of Rajya Sabha need not reside in the state which they represent. Most importantly, most polity-wide parties' nomination to the Rajya Sabha depends on the central party support instead of the cross-partition regional support. And the state assemblies which formally elect the members of the second chamber. Consequently, the Rajya Sabha is more beholden to party political than to territorial interest. Although inter-ministerial conferences have developed in various policy areas of shared central state interest, the inter-state council did not develop into the intended apex body of the central state collaboration. State parties wielded influence during the period of the coalition and or minority government in India between 1989 2014, but they did not always propagate a more federal India, and in any case they were not representative of the Indian states as a whole. Indeed, unlike in Switzerland or Belgium, there is no formal requirement that ministers in the central cabinet originate from the various regions, let alone the states and the territories of India. Next to the Rajya Sabha and the Interstate Council, institutions that were constitutionally intended to play a role in the oiling the fabric of the central state relation in India, the Indian government set up a planning commission between its creation by cabinet resolution of March 15, 1950 and its demise and replacement with the Niti Aayog in January 2015. The Planning Commission functioned as a para-constitutional authority with the capacity to steer large section of the Indian economy. Indeed, the Planning Commission was tasked with the comprehensive planning for the state as a whole based on a careful appraisal of the resources and on an objective analysis of all the relevant economic factors which could be achieved more successfully through an organization free from the burden of the day-to-day administration but in constant touch with the government at the highest policy level. The activities of the Planning Commission pinged on the fabric of Indian federalism in two important ways, each of which will be looked upon in turn. Firstly, the Planning Commission advised the Indian central government on the disbursement of so-called plan grants, or non-statutory grants to the state, and approved separate state plans, including plans for the state borrowing and the disbursement of grant to the state. The Planning Commission operated alongside the Finance Commission, which controls the flow of the statutory or non discretionary grants from the central to the states, as it will be demonstrated a lack of coordination between both the commissions generated some inefficiencies in the process of grant allocation and somewhat undermined the autonomy of the finance commission. Secondly, the Planning Commission played a key role in designing, in conjunction with the individual ministries, and overseeing a vast set of the centrally sponsored schemes that earmarked certain programs for national development under the form of central and largely conditional matching grants. Frequently, these CSS, centrally sponsored schemes, touch upon competencies in which the states have shared or something even hold prime legislative responsibility: education, health, road, and connectivity. By bringing the central government to some of the policies space of the states, the Planning Commission increased its interdependent nature of the Indian federalism, and the extent to which this also produced centralization depended on the capacity of the states to influence the activities of the Planning Commission. In other words, were the states sufficiently compensated for these autonomy losses by increasing their shared rule at the center? It is to these questions to which this article turns next. Planning Commission and state autonomy. Planning Commission and the erosion of the state autonomy. The Planning Commission has been criticized for eroding the autonomy of the states and the union territories by reducing their shares in the overall plan outlay over time, and by making a larger part of that share conditional in nature. Indeed, the share of state and union territory outlays in the overall plan outlay gradually decreased over time from more than 63.5% in the first plan period 1951 to 56 to just about 41% in the 10th plan period 97 2002. Furthermore, the work of central plan funds passed on to the states as central assistance to the state took the form of the conditional grants, centrally sponsored schemes, or the additional central scheme. For instance, in 2014-15 union budget, 5.75 trillion rupees, or 26% of the all budgetary resources of the union government, were set aside as plan funds. About 41% of the plan funds, 2.37 trillion rupees, remained with the center, but the remaining 59% provided central assistance to the state. In 2014-15, the clear majority of this CAS, central assistance to the states, flows to the centrally sponsored schemes, about 2.53 trillion rupees, or approximately 75% of the central assistance to the state. The remaining 25%, or just 0.85 trillion rupees, provided plan assistance to the state based on a pre-set formula, the Godgil-Mukherjee formula, or was allocated as a special central plan assistant for the special category state at northeastern state plus Himachal Pradesh, Jammu and Kashmir, and Uttarakhand. These developments gave rise to the at least three concerns. First, it made little sense to have the Planning Commission approve the annual plans of the states when state discretion was limited to additional central assistance for addressing specific problems of particular state. Additional central assistance made up a very small part of the proposed state plans, and they benefited up to 18 states in 2013-14. Second period to the fourth plan, 69-74, all plan assistance to the states was discretionary. The loss of the power of Congress in 8 state assemblies in the 1967 assembly election pushed non-Congress ruled states into demanding a less discretionary and more formulaic approach in state 1968, the National Development Council, a forum in which the Prime Minister, the members of the Planning Commission, Chief Ministers, and the Lieutenant Governor of the Union Territories met, adopted a resolution in which the share of the conditional grants was not to exceed more than one-sixth of all grants. As a result, normal central assistance to the states came to follow the unconditional and predictable Godgil Mukherjee formula. However, in response to Indira Gandhi, Prime Minister at that time, endorsed several non-formulaic and discretionary transfers and used them as a form of economic patron patronage. This set up the stage for a gradual proliferation of so-called centrally sponsored schemes and additional central assistance, so that at the time of the 2014-15 budget, the share of federal non-statutory grants, which followed the Godgil-Mukherjee formula and had dropped to below 25%. The relative rise in this disbursement of the discretionary plan grants and the sharp drop in the normal central plan assistance to the state based on Godgil Mukherjee formula also reflected disagreement among the state on the most effective way for addressing interstate inequalities. These disagreements were successfully exploited by the center to increase its grip on the states. Despite the various modifications since it was first introduced in 67, the Godgil Mukherjee formula faced criticism from the richer state because performance-based criteria dropped below only 7.5% of the outcome. Conversely, given that population figures in the formula, which accounted for 60%, used 1970 census data to reward states that has pursued more effective birth control policies, the poor but in demographic term fastest growing state of the North India, Uttar Pradesh, Bihar, Rajasthan, Odisha, reaped only small benefits from its application. This explains why Bihar made a forceful case to receive recognition as a special category state, such that it could access a special central and special plan assistance grants earmarked for the northeastern state and Jammu and Kashmir. The standoff between resource-rich and resource-poor states, which cut across parties, contributed to the decreasing significance of Godgil-Mukherjee formula. Driven grants and explained the difficulties in changing the formula, reflecting concern with the status quo. The government of the India agreed in May 2013 to set up a committee for evolving a composite development index of states under the presidency of Raghuram G. Rajan. The committee recommended the allocation of central government funds to the states on the basis of the composite state development index, built around 10 indicators: the absence of gross per capita state product in lieu of a monthly per capita consumption index, due specific attention in this regard, with a further fifth of all funds to be disbursed on the basis of the performance. The report was not without controversy. Tamil Nadu Chief Minister Jayalalitha condemned the report as an attempt to undermine the work of Finance Commission and the thinly discussed attempt to provide an intellectual justification to deliver resources to a potential political ally. More in particular, Nitish Kumar, Chief Minister of Bihar, representing the JDU, who broke ranks with the BJP in the world up to 2014 Lok Sabha election and repeatedly made the case of the Bihar's inclusion in the group of special category state. A third autonomy concerns of the state related to the increase in the centrally sponsored schemes, as indicated above. State scheme proliferated after the introduction of formulaic grants in 1968. The Planning Commission played an important role in the co-designing such schemes, and their monitoring CSS can cover anything from primary education expansion program, child nutrition, urban renewal, rural employment infrastructure needs, and poverty alleviation more generally. They frequently touch upon shared and even exclusive state competencies. Ideologically, such schemes are interesting for the center in that it can strategically deploy resources across the country with a view to realize national welfare objectives. Politically, these schemes also voters to the parties and command of the central polity, given that all polity wide parties and regional allies amass a good deal of support among the some groups in need of protection, such as other backward classes, castes, and scheduled tribes, scheduled castes, or religious minority. The disbursement of these discretionary programs also enable the party in central government to support those states on which it has a stronghold or cooperative with the regional ally, as evidenced by Chanchal Kumar Sharma in his contribution to his special issue. However, the CSS funding and discretionary contribution discussing not all states have been equally happy with these programs. In fact, the state criticism revolve around the following three issues. First, ideological preference or material needs to explain why many states have been accepting of such central schemes, notwithstanding the infringement on state rights so which they can bring to bear. Particularly low income states often welcomed CSS as a means to develop in critical areas. In contrast, affluent states or state controlled by parties in the central oppositions were no more hostile and instrumental in triggering a periodic review of CSS with a view to reduce their number and significance. For instance, Chaturvedi 2011 and Rangarajan reports 2011 proposed to contain CSS to just 70 flagship scheme from a high of 144 in 2011. At the disagreement among states themselves on utility of this scheme prevented a more comprehensive reforms in the consolidation. Second, a range of the state lamented CSS for several regions for which at least the center is held partially responsible. First, due to the central regulation, CSS lacked flexibility. This universal character was meant to minimize interstate discrimination but also prevented states from trading off CSS in areas where they saw no need of for support in the areas where that need was more apparent. For instance, Chaudhary refers to Tamil Nadu's obligation to implement a rural road infrastructure program, even though its rural villages were already well connected. Second, the design of CSS by central ministries and the Planning Commission, sometimes with the input of activities or advisory groups such as the National Advisory Council under UPA 1, failed to take state specific circumstances into account. For instance, the cost of infrastructure is not the same in Kerala than in more sparsely and mountainous states of the northeast. Third, without proper coordination, CSS led to the unnecessary duplication of or inefficiencies where they coincided with the state specific welfare schemes in the same policy field. Fourth, CSS could boil down to unfunded mandate, which shifted an ever larger cost of their implementation to the state. For instance, by reducing the matching contribution of the center, states also took responsibility for the assets, revenue expenditure of these funds and had to support local government with a limited resources based on their own and therefore relied on the state to cover ongoing staff costs even after such schemes were terminated. Fifth, until 2013-14, more than a third of the resources set aside for centrally sponsored